Welcome to the guide, Exile. In this guide we will be discussing and reviewing strategies for reaching and defeating one of the endgame bosses known as Atziri, Queen of the Vaal. Atziri was the last queen of the Vaal civilization. The narcissistic queen plunged the Vaal civilization into a dark age of sacrifice and terror almost 2,000 years ago. Millions died due to her obsessive pursuit of eternal youth, a pursuit that brought about a cataclysm that ended the Vaal civilization overnight. But Atziri herself still lingers in a nightmare realm that is starting to leak back into the land of Rayclast. This realm holds not only Atziri, but her guardians and constructs, that all require dexterity and knowledge to take down. If you do manage to defeat these ancient foes, you could be rewarded with some very lucrative gear and items that can only be acquired from this encounter. There are actually two versions of the Atziri encounter. The lower level encounter is the Apex of Sacrifice, which is level 70, and the higher level encounter is the Alluring Abyss, which is level 80. All of the mechanics are the same in both of these encounters, but in the Alluring Abyss, the monsters are not only higher level, but their damage and life is also increased by 100% on top of that. For this guide, we will be discussing how to complete the lower level Apex of Sacrifice, as the Alluring Abyss is very difficult and requires practice and knowledge of the fights through the Apex. Now, many people wonder what level you have to be, or how much damage you need before you can beat this encounter. Since there are so many different types of builds and types of damage, there is no simple answer to these questions. For the most part in these encounters, if you can manipulate the monsters, position yourself correctly with the proper movement skill, and understand the mechanics, you can complete all of these boss fights with even low damage. Of course, having higher damage will make the fights safer as they will be shorter. As a rule of thumb, here are some general things you should aim for. About 5,000 effective HP, that includes some combination of life and energy shield. 75% capped elemental resistances, and some chaos resistance. About negative 20% is alright to deal with the chaos constructs and the boss fights. Atziri's Promise is a good flask for this purpose. A fast movement skill. This includes, but is not limited to, whirling blades, shield charge, or flame dash with faster casting. Some sort of elemental mitigation beyond your elemental resistances. This includes, but is not limited to, fortify, or elemental flasks that provide plus to maximum resistances. Some sort of physical damage mitigation. This includes, but is not limited to, fortify, a basalt flask, a granite flask, or endurance charges. As for damage output, if you can kill and deal with tier 10 plus maps, you should have enough damage to complete the Apex of Sacrifice encounters. The Apex of Sacrifice can be opened by using the 4 sacrifice fragments that are found in Vaal side zones. These fragments are the sacrifice at dawn, noon, dusk, and midnight. These must be placed together such that they form a circle or the zone will not open. Upon correct activation, 6 portals to the Apex will appear. Before entering the Apex, ensure that you have all the gear and items you will need for the fights. I will be discussing more specific recommended items throughout the guide. The Apex of Sacrifice is comprised of 7 zones. The first zone is a safe zone where there are no monsters, allowing for the player to prepare. The remaining zones include 3 general monster zones that are comprised of magic and rare monsters with no normal monsters, and 3 boss arenas. The order of the zones flip-flop between general monster zones and boss arenas, allowing the player to recuperate their flask charges and charge up Vaal skills before boss fights. Since all of the general monsters in the Apex are magic or rare, they provide great experience rates as long as you do not die, and have great drop tables. Make sure to be careful of all the dangerous bloodline and nemesis modifiers when killing these monsters. Once you reach the boss arena entries, make sure that you drop a portal so that you can easily return to the fight if you make a mistake and die. The first boss that you encounter is actually a dual boss fight. These are the Vessel of the Vaals, which have the same model and follow a similar moveset as the Vaal Oversoul in the end of Act 2. Note that there is a 2-tile safe zone that extends into the boss arena from the entrance, and reaches all the way to the walls, that you can walk around in before triggering the bosses. This is true for all of the remaining boss encounters, allowing you to set up your skills or traps before engaging the bosses. To engage the Vessel bosses, you simply have to walk by each of the altars. Now the Vessels can perform the following attacks. An overhead slam. The Vessel will switch to and lifts the ball end of the arm above its head and slams it to the ground, dealing deadly physical and fire damage. The recommendation for this move is to move out of the way of its slam, as it is very slow and easy to dodge. It will cast a laser beam. The Vessel switches to a fork-style arm and fires a lightning laser, resulting in lightning damage and application of shock. It will fire this numerous times. Recommendation for this move is to move out of the way of the laser, as well as have a shock removal flask. Lightning balls. The Vessel will cast a massive wall of lightning ball spells. These deal lightning damage and can apply shock. Recommendation is to try and avoid these or push through them quickly, as well as having a shock removal flask. They can also fire an ice storm. The The vessel will fire numerous ice storms without switching to a specific arm, and this can freeze and chill players where they stand. Recommendation is to avoid these grounds as best as possible, as well as having a freeze immunity flask. And finally, they can cast an ad spawn. They will simply spawn some monsters that can be killed for flask charges, and do not pose major threats to the player. Defensively, it is recommended to have both shock and freeze removal and immunity utility flasks. Having these affixes on a utility flask ensures that the effect lasts for the entire flask duration. These flask suffixes are of grounding and of heat. If you do fear for your elemental defenses further, you can also make use of a topaz flask to increase your maximum resistance against lightning attacks that the vessels perform. As a side note, a great Vaal skill to make use of for all bosses, especially in the Apex, is the Vaal lightning trap skill. You can place this trap underneath where the boss is spawning so that it will automatically trigger once the boss is attackable, applying shock to the boss. The shock status element means that the shock target will take 50% increased damage from all sources, effectively reducing the time the fight has to last. Offensively, to engage these bosses, you should first walk by one of the altars and then by the second altar a few seconds later. This offsets their spawns from each other so that you can begin damage on the first Vaal and switch to the second Vaal once the first Vaal goes back down. They will always begin by spawning adds and then going back under the ground. Sometimes these bosses can go back down immediately after coming up, depending on their attack queue or if they are stunned by your damage. Now, bosses in the Apex will enrage once their partner dies. This means that they will gain increased attack speed and cast speed, as well as becoming immune to all elemental status ailments. So for the vessels, you will want to try and time their deaths at the same time, to avoid fighting an enraged vessel for an extended period of time. If you are unable to kill these bosses on their first times up, make sure to keep moving and getting in damage on them while they are swapping arms and attack types, making use of your flasks and movement skills appropriately. After you have defeated these bosses, you can move through to the next general monster zone, refilling your flasks and Vaal skills, heading for the second boss encounter, the Trio. Don't forget to drop a portal outside the boss arena entrance. The trio consists of A'alai, Quora, and Ya-Raz. This encounter can be more deadly than the actual Atziri encounter that follows it. These bosses work together to deal damage, mainly in the forms of physical and chaos attacks, and are very deadly even on their own. Like with the vessels, these bosses will enrage once there's only one remaining. However, unlike the vessels, when one boss is killed, that boss will drop a large black mist area of effect physical degeneration where they died, and the other bosses will recover to full health. They will also perform an ad spawn upon death, where monsters will begin to spawn in the physical degeneration area. Here are the different attacks that each boss can perform. A'alai is the most deadly of the three. She can make use of ranged attacks and is the hardest to lure around the room. Her attacks include projectiles, physical damage projectiles that can vary between 1 to 3 projectiles per attack. Rain of Arrows, a physical damage area of effect rain of arrows. Firestorm, casts a physical firestorm that lasts 4 seconds. It can stack and will last for 30 seconds if she is the last boss. If this boss is left last, she will deal massive amounts of physical damage and become very deadly with all of her stacking area damage. Ya-Raz is the second deadliest boss, making use of physical and fire damage, as well as reflect mechanics. Luckily, he can be lured around the room easier and does not hit as hard as A'alai. His attacks include Dual Strike, a dual strike that deals physical and fire damage as well as igniting the player. A Self-Enrage. He casts a Self-Enrage in which he is depicted as on fire. This buff increases the fire damage he does, as well as reflecting a percentage of the player's damage as fire damage. If this boss is left last, he will have almost full uptime on his Fire Reflect Enrage, and it will deal more reflect damage as he gets closer to death. Quora is the least dangerous of the trio and makes use of physical and bleeding damage. As with Ya-Raz, he can be lured around the room easier and does not hit as hard as A'alai. His attacks include Cleave. Attacks with a cleave that deals physical damage and applies 2 stacks of corrupting blood. Cyclone. A fast-moving cyclone that deals physical damage and leaves a trail of desecrated ground that deals chaos damage. If this boss is left last, he will simply attack faster and now stack up to 8 corrupting bloods per attack rather than 2. Defensively, it is recommended to have good physical and chaos mitigation for all of the bosses, as well as bleed removal on a utility flask to avoid stacks of corrupting blood from Quora. The fire damage and reflect from Ya-Raz is not as big of an issue here, as you can time your attacks around it. Make use of at least a Basalt Flask, Granite Flask, Endurance Charges, or Immortal Call, and a cast when damage taken. Offensively, you will want to engage and kill these bosses in a specific order. As mentioned previously, certain bosses are much deadlier than the others. The recommended kill order is A'alai, Ya-Raz, and Quora. This is because A'alai is the most deadly boss and will be the toughest to deal with last. Recall that you will have 2 tiles deep of space to move around in before engaging these bosses. This allows you to place your totems or Vaal lightning traps before engagement. It is also important to recall that all of these bosses drop a very large degeneration cloud upon death, so you'll have to make sure to try and kill these bosses in proper locations. As mentioned before, it is recommended to kill A'alai first, in the center of the zone where she spawns, as it is very difficult to lure her anywhere else. Ya-Raz will begin to the left of the arena, and Quora will begin to the back right of the arena. They will move on top of you and may require some repositioning if you are using an area of effect skill, such that you do not kill one of them first. Remember to keep your physical mitigations up and watch for corrupting blood stacks from Quora passing over you. If your defenses are not strong enough, watch for when A'alai fires her projectiles in an upward direction. This is her rain of arrows or her firestorm attack, and it can deal deadly damage, so make sure to move out of the way if possible. After A'alai is dead, make sure to quickly move out of her degeneration zone. You will now want to try and kill Ya-Raz close to the degeneration zone from A'alai, or near a corner. It is best to try and leave a full path around the exterior of the zone so you can path around to lure the last boss. Remember to try and keep your physical mitigations up and watch for corrupting blood stacks from Quora. Ya-Raz's enraged fire reflect will generally not deal that much damage back to you if he is not the last boss, but if it is, avoid attacking him while he is enraged and on fire. After Ya-Raz is dead, make sure again to move out of the physical degeneration zone as quick as possible. Remember to maintain all of the adds that are spawning to make sure that they do not overwhelm you and to give you more flask charges. Finally, you will want to kill Quora. Since he is the last boss, it does not matter where he is killed since the degenerations will disappear after the fight is complete. Now that Quora is the only boss left, he will be enraged and immune to status ailments. It also means he will be much faster applying 8 stacks of corrupting blood rather than 2. This means you will have to manage your bleed flasks appropriately, making sure to never leave bleeding stacks on you. This fight can be very tough depending on how the bosses stack their attacks on you and the kill order that ends up occurring. Many times the wrong boss can die in the wrong order, or in the wrong area, making the fight more difficult. Recovering from this can be tough, but doable as long as you position and pay attention to the mechanics appropriately. After you have defeated these bosses, you can move through the next general monster zone, refilling your flasks and Vaal skills, heading for the final boss encounter, Atziri, Queen of the Vaal. Do not forget to drop a portal outside of the boss arena entrance. Atziri is the final boss encounter of the Apex of Sacrifice, and quite a challenging encounter if you are unaware of her mechanics. She makes use of many different attacks and spells, and has a few different forms that she will enter. This is a fight where a use of a movement skill or proper Quicksilver Flask will be vital. Basic information for all of her forms include: she does not enrage, but she is immune to elemental status ailments, stun, and knockback. She reflects curses cast upon her back to the caster. This includes curses that are cast with blasphemy. Atziri's first form is the form that you will see when you engage her first. She will make use of the following attacks and spells. Spears, an arc of red spears that deal physical damage and apply bleed. It is best to try and sidestep these, but the damage is not too great in the Apex of Sacrifice. Flame Blast, a single flame blast with a short channel that deals fire damage and ignites. This is not deadly with a ruby flask, but can take a large chunk of your health, leaving you very vulnerable if you do not recover quickly. Empowered Flame Blast, multiple randomly placed empowered flame blasts with massive AoE radius. This spell penetrates 8% of fire resistance, meaning that you will only have an effective 67% fire resistance against this spell. This skill can easily kill most players in a single hit and should be avoided at all costs. The quantity of flame blasts increases for every additional player in the instance, meaning that there will be 3 flame blasts with 2 players, 4 flame blasts with 3 players, and so on. Storm Calls, a chain of randomly placed storm calls that deal lightning damage. Each storm call is marked with an orange circle and explodes after 3 seconds of being placed, in quick succession. Empowered Storm Calls, a chain of randomly placed empowered storm calls dealing lightning damage. These storm calls are marked with a thick yellow circle. This spell behaves the same as the orange storm call, but deals 50% more damage. This spell should be absolutely avoided. A topaz flask can be used as a safe measure, but will not always save you. And at Ziri's second form, she shields herself, preventing her from taking damage. She then summons minions from random body piles that line the room. These minions will walk towards her and heal her when they reach her, and they will not attack you. The best way to keep these minions from healing her is to stand as close to Atziri as possible, and use an area of effect skill to clear the minions. This is by far the safest phase and a good time for refilling flasks, regenerating life, or recharging your energy shield. After the minions have stopped spawning, Atziri will return to her first form a few seconds later. And at Atziri's third form, Atziri splits into 4 copies of herself. This phase happens at fixed intervals at 75%, 50%, and 25% of her life pool. If in her second form these minions heal her back to one of those life levels, she will not do this phase again. Only one of the 4 copies needs to be defeated before you can fight Atziri in her first form again. Here are the following copies. Spear copy. Holds a spear in her hand that fires a single projectile at the player, dealing bleeding damage over time. Flame Blast copy. Has fire on her hand and casts a single flame blast on top of the player's current location. Stormcall copy. Has lightning on her hand and casts a chain of randomly placed stormcalls. Mirror copy. Has a mirror and reflects a high amount of damage. Attacking this with direct damage is fatal and not recommended to attack this copy at all. These 4 copies of Atziri spawn in random patterns, so you must make sure to check which copy you are planning to attack. Defensively, you will want to make sure that you have a proper movement skill that is reliable and fast. This includes, but is not limited to, fast whirling blades, shield charge, or faster casting flame dash. It is recommended to have shock, burn, and bleed removal and immunity on your utility flasks. It is also recommended to use a topaz and ruby flask if you are unsure about your dodging skills on her storm calls and flame blasts. Remember that any curses you apply on Atziri will be reflected back to you, so it may be worth using a curse removal and immunity flask for this reason. As mentioned within Atziri's forms, you will always want to be moving around and avoiding as many of the attacks and spells that she performs, as they can deal deadly damage. It is very easy to move around the arena and avoid these attacks without doing any damage yourself. Let's talk about some specific offensive strategies for her different forms. Recall that you will have 2 tiles deep of space to move around in before engaging this boss. This allows you to place your totems or Vaal lightning traps before engagement. In Atziri's first form, you will want to be making sure to get in attacks on Atziri while she is not channeling any type of flame blast. Once she begins to cast either of the flame blasts, you will want to make sure to move out of the way of these skills as fast as possible. For her storm calls, you will have a few seconds to continue damage on her while she begins her storm call channeling, before they blow up. Again, you will want to move out of the way of these, making sure not to stand in any of them. If you are unable to move out of the way fast enough, make sure to use either your topaz or ruby flask if you have one, and try to recover your life as quickly as possible. In her second form, you simply have to kill the minions as they come to Atziri, standing on top of her using an area of effect skill, which makes this phase very easy and straightforward. In her third form, things can get very hectic, and requires some quick target acquisition to make sure you are not attacking the copy of Atziri with the mirror. In this phase, I generally choose to go after the Stormcall Atziri, since you can easily identify the purple arm before the Atziri summons in. You can choose any of the other copies except for the mirror. Doing this fight on a large uncontrollable area of effect skill, like Tornado Shot, can be very difficult. This is because the skill can undoubtedly hit the mirror copy, killing you instantly. So make sure to avoid that copy as best as possible, trying to attack a copy on the opposite side of it, if necessary. Recall that only one of these Atziri copies needs to be killed to progress the fight past this form. To start this phase, I recommend going to the center of the room. If you have a totem, I recommend placing it in the center on top of you. This will ensure that Atziris will target the same location, making the attack progression predictable. You can also begin one of the corners facing the copy you wish to attack. Once they spawn, they will all attack you where you stand, with the flame blast occurring there as well. You will want to immediately move out of the flame blast as soon as you see it across the Atziri copy of your choice and begin attacking her. If you do not kill her before the next flame blast, simply keep moving out of the flame blasts as they appear. During this time, ensure that you are not standing in any of her storm calls, and if you need to, you can move away from Atziri to bait the flame blasts and the spears further away. This form is the toughest to get the mechanics down on since it's so hectic and requires some quick maneuvering to avoid getting stacked out by the storm calls, flame blasts, and spears. Remember that if you do die and come back in through the portal outside of the boss arena, you will have a grace period upon re-entering the boss arena. This means that you will be invulnerable and be able to stand still and time the attack pattern to get back into the fight easier, generally waiting for the flame blast and spear to occur before moving to your Atziri of choice. Now, if you finally have managed to get through all of her forms and defeat Atziri, you will have the possibility of receiving the following Atziri-only item drops. For the lower level Apex of Sacrifice Atziri encounter, she will always drop one of the following. Atziri's Promise is the most common drop from Atziri and only holds value in the beginning of the league, but is incredibly useful on all build types. Atziri's Steps are the second most common drop, and they provide great overall defenses for evasion-based builds. The Doriani's Invitation Belts come in 4 different forms: cold, fire, lightning, and physical versions. Depending on the version you get, they could be worth something or nothing. Finally, the Doriani's Catalyst Scepter is the rarest item drop from the normal Atziri. This weapon is very powerful for elemental-based builds and can be very valuable during the beginning of a league. So since these uniques generally do not hold their value for long, why do the normal version of Atziri? Well, she can also drop the Mortal Fragment pieces. These Mortal Fragments are used just like the Sacrifice Fragments to enter the higher level encounter of Atziri called the Alluring Abyss. The Alluring Abyss is much more difficult as mentioned before, but has very powerful item drops that can come from it. This means that people will be trying to complete it, constantly requiring these fragments. Mortal Ignorance and Hope are the rarest and worth the most, while Mortal Rage and Grief are more common and not worth as much. For the higher level Alluring Abyss Atziri encounter, she will always drop one of the following uniques. The most expensive and chase uniques from this encounter are the Atziri Acuity Gloves and the Atziri's Disfavor Axe. Within the entire zone, you can also receive the Ethereal Divination card. 7 of these cards will result in a 6-link Vaal Regalia base, which is highly sought after. One of these cards alone is worth a lot, so make sure to be full clearing all of the monsters. The Apex of Sacrifice encounter requires a lot of practice and understanding of mechanics. With time, you should be able to take this boss down with ease, especially as your character grows with power. This encounter makes for a great method for farming early league currency, both from raw drops from the magic monsters and Atziri only item drops, as well as practice for moving on to the Alluring Abyss encounter. So congratulations, Exile, you have killed one of your first endgame bosses. On a side note, I have made a Patreon account for this channel by recommendation of many viewers. If you wish to support my creation of Path of Exile guides, feel free to check the page out. I in no way need or require donations for me to continue these videos, so fear not, the guides will continue. If you have any recommendations for guides that you would like to see, give suggestions in the comments. I am up for making guides for whatever content or difficulties you are having. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next guide, Exiles.